Will Smith, a global icon whose charisma and talent had defined a career spanning decades, was no stranger to the weight of public scrutiny. The infamous Oscars incident, where he'd confronted a comedian on stage, had left an indelible mark, sparking debates that lingered long after the headlines faded. So when Jimmy Kimmel Live announced him as the guest for a primetime episode, the anticipation was electric. Would Kimmel, known for his sharp humor and willingness to tread controversial waters, bring up that night? Could Smith, still navigating the fallout, handle the inevitable questions with his trademark charm? The studio buzzed with nervous energy, the audience primed for a spectacle. Kimmel took the stage, his grin wide but carrying a sly edge, as he opened with a nod to Smith's recent film projects. "We've got Will Smith tonight, folks," he said, pausing as the crowd roared. "But can we talk about the elephant in the room?" The laughter was immediate, tinged with unease. Why had Smith agreed to this interview, knowing Kimmel's penchant for provocation? Was he here to reclaim his narrative, or was he walking into a trap? The stage was set, the lights blazed, and Kimmel's opening monologue leaned heavily into subtle jabs about Hollywood controversies, each one inching closer to that Oscars moment. The audience leaned in, sensing a storm brewing. What would happen when Smith took the stage? Could Kimmel push without breaking? Had Smith come prepared to deflect, or was something rawer simmering beneath his polished exterior? No one could have predicted the clash that would unfold, leaving the internet ablaze and Kimmel stunned. Hit that like button if you didn't see this coming, subscribe for more jaw-dropping moments, and comment below. Was Will right to walk out, or did Kimmel cross the line? The audience's cheers erupted as Will Smith strode onto the stage, his presence a blend of effortless charisma and guarded intensity. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he flashed a familiar megawatt smile, but his eyes carried a weight, scanning the crowd before settling on Jimmy Kimmel. The host rose to greet him, his handshake firm but his smile tinged with mischief, as if already plotting his approach. The crowd's applause was deafening, a testament to Smith's enduring star power, but an undercurrent of anticipation rippled through the studio. Kimmel eased into the interview, starting with praise for Smith's recent work, particularly his latest film, a gritty drama that had critics buzzing. Smith responded warmly, his voice steady as he shared insights about the role's emotional demands, the audience hanging on his every word. The conversation flowed smoothly at first, with Kimmel tossing out light-hearted questions about Smith's return to the big screen. But the mood shifted when Kimmel veered toward the Oscars, his tone playful but pointed. He held up a photo from that fateful night, the image flashing on the screen behind them, and made a quip about Smith's memorable moment. The audience laughed, but Smith's smile tightened, his fingers tapping briefly on the armrest. He deflected with a vague comment about moving forward, but his posture stiffened, a subtle sign of discomfort. Kimmel, undeterred, leaned in with another jab, suggesting that night had redefined award show drama. The crowd chuckled, but Smith's gaze sharpened, his silence louder than the applause. The crew in the control booth exchanged glances, sensing the first sparks of tension. Had Kimmel's mention of the Oscars struck a raw nerve? Was Smith's restraint a mask, or was he biding his time? The stage felt charged, the stakes rising with each passing second, as the interview edged closer to confrontation. The studio's atmosphere grew heavy as Jimmy Kimmel's pointed jabs about the Oscars incident cast a shadow over the interview. The audience, still chuckling at his quip about award show drama, began to sense the shift, their laughter fading into murmurs. Will Smith sat with a composed exterior, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation, his hands now still, clasped tightly in his lap. Kimmel, emboldened by the crowd's earlier response, pressed further, his tone teetering between playful and provocative. He pulled out a mock Oscar statuette, holding it up with a grin and joking about whether Smith had a special place for it after that night. The crowd roared, some clapping eagerly, but Smith's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the barb. He responded with a measured comment, emphasizing his focus on growth and family, but his voice carried a subtle edge, a warning Kimmel seemed to overlook. The host, leaning into his comedic rhythm, doubled down, asking if Smith had considered a sequel to the Oscars moment, complete with a theatrical reenactment of a slow-motion slap. The audience's laughter was mixed with gasps, the room's energy tilting toward unease. Smith's posture grew rigid, his gaze locking onto Kimmel with an intensity that seemed to still the studio. He offered a brief, clipped response, deflecting the joke but making it clear the topic was off-limits. The camera caught a close-up of his face, the warmth from earlier replaced by a steely resolve. The crew in the control booth tensed, the monitors showing Kimmel's mischievous grin and Smith's smoldering restraint. Had Kimmel's relentless focus on the Oscars crossed into disrespect? Was Smith's patience fraying, or was he calculating a response? The interview was no longer a casual exchange. It was a tightrope, and the audience could feel the balance, slipping each moment charged with the promise of escalation. The studio's air thickened with tension, as Jimmy Kimmel's relentless jabs about the Oscars incident pushed the interview into treacherous waters. Will Smith's clipped responses had done little to deter Kimmel, whose grin now carried a hint of recklessness, as if he thrived on the edge of controversy. The audience, their laughter now sparse, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the raw nerve Kimmel was prodding. Undeterred, the host leaned forward, his eyes glinting with mischief as he held up a cartoonish sketch of Smith on the Oscar stage, mid-confrontation, with exaggerated features. "This went viral for a reason, Will," Kimmel said, pausing, for effect, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "You made history!" The crowd's reaction was mixed, some chuckling nervously, others murmuring in unease. Smith's face was a mask of controlled fury, his hands gripping the armrests, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity that seemed to shrink the room. He responded briefly, his voice low, stating that the moment was personal, not a spectacle for cheap laughs. But Kimmel, misreading the warning, pressed on, joking about whether Smith had rehearsed for the next award season. The audience gasped, the quip landing like a spark in dry grass. Smith's posture stiffened, his silence a deafening rebuke that left Kimmel's laughter sounding hollow. The camera zoomed in, capturing the slow burn of Smith's anger, a storm gathering behind his composed facade. The crew in the control booth exchanged panicked glances, the monitors flashing between Kimmel's faltering grin and Smith's unyielding stare. "Folks, you can feel the heat in this room." The YouTube narrator's voice cuts in, low and urgent. Kimmel's digging deeper, but Will's not backing down. "Is this about to explode? Keep watching, because it's only getting wilder." Had Kimmel's mockery crossed an unforgivable line? Was Smith's restraint about to snap, or was he biding his time for a calculated strike? The stage was a powder keg, and the audience could sense the fuse burning, each second pulsing with the promise of a confrontation that would leave jaws on the floor. The studio pulsed with a taut energy, Will Smith's icy silence in the wake of Jimmy Kimmel's Oscars jabs hanging like a storm cloud. The host's cartoonish sketch and flippant remarks had stripped away the interview's veneer of civility, leaving the audience on edge, their murmurs replacing earlier laughter. Smith sat rigid, his hands now still, his eyes locked on Kimmel with a piercing intensity that seemed to unravel the host's confidence. Kimmel, sensing the shift but clinging to his comedic instincts, tried to pivot, his voice tinged with forced levity as he asked about Smith's upcoming projects. But the question felt like a lifeline thrown too late, the room still heavy with the weight of his earlier provocations. Smith's responses were curt, his tone sharp, offering little beyond a nod to his work's focus on redemption. The audience leaned forward, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing the fragility of the moment. Kimmel, sweat beading on, his brow ventured another quip, suggesting Smith's next role should be Oscar's security. The crowd gasped, a few nervous chuckles breaking the silence, but Smith's reaction was swift, his voice low and cutting as he accused Kimmel of exploiting his pain for ratings. The words landed like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Kimmel's smile faltered, his hands fumbling with a pen as he tried to laugh it off, but the deflection was weak, the crowd's response tepid. The camera captured the raw tension, zooming in on Smith's smoldering resolve and Kimmel's strained composure. "Look at Will's face," the YouTube narrator whispers, voice thick with anticipation. "He's done playing nice. Kimmel's in deep, and this is about to get real. You won't believe what's next." Had Kimmel's relentless focus on the Oscars pushed Smith to his breaking point? Was the host's humor about to backfire spectacularly, or could he salvage the spiraling segment? The confrontation was a coiled spring, ready to snap, as the audience waited for the moment that would define the night. The studio was a crucible of raw tension. Will Smith's accusation that Jimmy Kimmel was exploiting his pain for ratings reverberating through the stunned audience. The crowd, now silent, sat riveted, their eyes locked on Smith's steely resolve and Kimmel's crumbling facade. The host, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and desperation, tried to regain control, his voice cracking as he offered a half-hearted apology, claiming his jokes were meant to lighten the mood. But the words rang hollow, drowned by the weight of Smith's unyielding stare. Smith leaned forward slightly, his posture a study in controlled fury, his eyes burning with a fire that seemed to expose Kimmel's every misstep. The audience's murmurs grew louder, a blend of shock and fascination, as Kimmel scrambled to pivot, asking about Smith's family life in a bid to shift the focus. But Smith's responses remained clipped, his tone laced with disdain, refusing to let the host off the hook. Kimmel, sensing the segment unraveling, tried one last quip, suggesting Smith could slap his way to an Oscar comeback. The crowd gasped, the joke landing like a match in gasoline, and Smith's reaction was immediate, his voice rising with a controlled intensity as he condemned Kimmel for turning his personal struggles into a circus. The audience erupted in a mix of gasps and scattered cheers, the room's energy tilting decisively toward Smith. Kimmel's smile vanished, his hands stalling mid-gesture, his eyes darting to the audience for support that wasn't coming. The camera zoomed in, capturing Smith's righteous indignation and Kimmel's visible panic. "This is it, folks," Jimmy Kimmel's voice cuts in, urgent and hushed. "Will's not holding back, and Kimmel's got nowhere to hide. Can you feel the heat? It's about to boil over." Had Kimmel's persistence pushed Smith beyond restraint? Was Smith poised to deliver a final blow, or had he already claimed the upper hand? The confrontation was at its boiling point, a clash of wills that held the audience captive, each second crackling with the promise of a decisive moment. The studio was a pressure cooker, Will Smith's blistering condemnation of Jimmy Kimmel's mockery ringing like a verdict through the electrified audience. His accusation that Kimmel had turned his struggles into a circus had shifted the room's dynamic. The crowd now a mix of stunned silence and scattered cheers, their allegiance tilting toward Smith's raw authenticity. Kimmel, his face a mask of humiliation, slumped slightly behind his desk, his hands gripping the edge as if to steady himself. His attempt at a chuckle was feeble, his voice barely audible as he mumbled about the challenges of live television, but the words were swallowed by the weight of Smith's commanding presence. Smith sat tall, his eyes locked on the host with an intensity that seemed to unravel Kimmel's last shred of composure. The audience leaned forward, their whispers growing into a low hum, as Kimmel tried to pivot, asking a weak question about Smith's future in Hollywood. But Smith wasn't done, his voice steady but searing as he challenged Kimmel's right to judge his life from behind a desk. The crowd gasped, some clapping in awe, as the words landed with surgical precision, exposing the host's reliance on cheap shots. Kimmel's face reddened, his eyes darting to the floor, his usual wit buried under the onslaught. The camera captured every excruciating detail, zooming in on Smith's righteous fury and Kimmel's shrinking figure. The crew in the control booth stood frozen, the monitors flashing between Smith's unyielding resolve and Kimmel's floundering panic. Talk about a power shift, as Kimmel's voice chimes in, thick with excitement. Will's owning this moment, and Kimmel's out of moves. Is this the endgame? Or is there more? You gotta see this. Had Smith's verbal strike dismantled Kimmel's credibility? Was the host about to face a reckoning, or could he claw back some semblance of control? The confrontation was a wildfire, burning through the studio's polished facade, as the audience waited for the moment that would seal the night's legacy. The studio was a battlefield, Will Smith's relentless challenge to Jimmy Kimmel's judgment leaving the host exposed and reeling. The audience, now fully in Smith's thrall, erupted in a mix of cheers and stunned murmurs, their eyes locked on the icon's commanding presence and Kimmel's crumbling veneer. Smith's accusation that Kimmel had no right to judge his life had struck like lightning, stripping away the host's comedic armor and leaving him visibly diminished. Kimmel, his face flushed with shame, tried to muster a response, stammering about the nature of comedy, but his voice cracked, the words lost in the wake of Smith's intensity. The crowd's energy was electric, their whispers turning to a low roar as Smith leaned forward, his voice rising with a controlled fury that demanded attention. He spoke of the personal toll of public scrutiny, his words raw and unfiltered, a direct rebuke to Kimmel's flippant jabs. The audience gasped, some nodding in empathy, others clapping in awe, as Smith's authenticity overwhelmed the studio's artificial warmth. Kimmel, sweat beading on his brow, tried one last deflection, suggesting they move on to lighter topics, but Smith's gaze didn't waver, his silence a final condemnation. The camera zoomed in, capturing the stark contrast between Smith's righteous indignation and Kimmel's floundering panic. The crew in the control booth scrambled, sensing the segment's collapse, the monitors flashing chaotic close-ups of Kimmel's ashen face and Smith's unyielding resolve. "This is unreal," Kimmel's voice cuts in, urgent and awestruck. "Will's not just fighting back, he's rewriting the story. Kimmel's done for, but what's next? You can't look away." Had Smith's raw honesty turned the tables for good? Was Kimmel's misstep about to cost him more than he could recover? The confrontation was reaching its zenith, a clash that had transcended the talk show format, leaving the audience riveted and the stage primed for a dramatic crescendo. The studio was a crucible of raw emotion, Will Smith's unfiltered rebuke of Jimmy Kimmel's mockery commanding the room like a tidal wave. His words, laced with the pain of public scrutiny, had silenced the audience, their cheers and murmurs, blending into a charged hush. Kimmel, now a shadow of his usual self, sat slumped behind his desk, his face pale, his hands motionless as he absorbed the weight of Smith's verbal onslaught. The host tried to interject, mumbling about respecting Smith's journey, but the attempt was feeble, drowned by the icon's towering presence. Smith's eyes, burning with a mix of defiance and vulnerability, remained fixed on Kimmel, his posture unyielding as he spoke of the cost of being reduced to a punchline. The crowd, some wiping tears, others clapping softly, was wholly captivated, their empathy aligning with Smith's raw honesty. Kimmel, desperate to salvage the wreckage, tried to shift gears, asking about Smith's philanthropy, but the question felt like a plea, ignored by the audience's focus on Smith. The tension reached a breaking point, and Smith's expression shifted, a flicker of exhaustion crossing his face, as if the weight of the moment had become too much. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate, his voice low as he stated he couldn't stay in a space that mocked his truth. The audience gasped, a collective jolt of shock as he turned and walked off, his silhouette vanishing behind the curtain, leaving a void where his intensity had been. Kimmel sat frozen, his mouth agape, his eyes darting to the crowd for support that wasn't there. Holy smokes, Jimmy Kimmel's voice bursts in, breathless. Will just walked out, and Kimmel's left in the dust. This is history in the making. Can you believe it? Had Smith's exit been a spontaneous act of self-preservation, or a calculated move to reclaim his dignity? Was Kimmel's humiliation complete, or could he recover from this public dismantling? The stage was a graveyard of Kimmel's missteps, and the audience was left reeling, sensing the prelude to a cultural firestorm. The studio lights dimmed as Will Smith's abrupt exit left a stunned silence, his final words about not staying in a space that mocked his truth echoing like a verdict. Jimmy Kimmel, still seated behind his desk, looked like a man caught in a riptide, his face ashen, his hands gripping the desk's edge as if to anchor himself. The audience, a mix of awe and disbelief, erupted into a chaotic blend of applause and whispers, their eyes locked on the empty stage where Smith had stood moments before. Kimmel forced a weak chuckle, his voice trembling as he muttered about the unpredictability of live television, but the attempt to salvage the moment fell flat. Swallowed by the raw power of Smith's departure, the band struck up a jarring tune, a desperate bid to fill the void, but the music clashed with the room's heavy atmosphere. The crew in the control booth, frantic, cut to commercial break, the monitors flashing with close-ups of Kimmel's flushed face and the audience's divided reactions. As the show paused, clips of Smith's walkout flooded the internet, igniting a cultural explosion. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags, memes of Smith's resolute stride, and Kimmel's stunned silence spreading like wildfire. News outlets pounced, with headlines screaming Will Smith storms off Kimmel after Oscars clash, and Kimmel left speechless by Smith's exit. Pundits hailed Smith as a titan who'd reclaimed his narrative, while Kimmel's team scrambled to edit the official upload, softening the sharpest edges, but unedited footage circulated relentlessly, racking up millions of views. Smith never addressed the incident, moving on to his next project with quiet dignity, his silence amplifying his triumph. The moment became a cultural touchstone, proof that one man's stand against mockery could shift the conversation, leaving Kimmel's stage a cautionary tale. That's a wrap on a legendary showdown, Jimmy Kimmel declares, vibrant with awe. Will owned that stage and walked away a king. Kimmel's got to rethink his game now. What's your take? Drop it in the comments. The audience, both in the studio and online, was left in reverence, witnessing a clash where Smith's defiance turned a late-night misfire into an iconic victory, cementing his legacy as untouchable.